Hello and welcome back to Joe's Art History podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical with me, your host and your resident art historian, Joe McLaughlin. Welcome back, it is episode 45 and today we're taking a deep dive into one of art history's most iconic artists, Vincent Van Gogh. Or Van Gogh, however you prefer to pronounce it. This week, I'm joined by Yorkshire-based artist Millie Cullen, who has a love and a passion for Vincent, which is just so obvious throughout the conversation. Millie takes us on a deep dive into Van Gogh's life, his mental health struggles, discusses the ear incident, and actually how it isn't what we're all led to believe, and the love between Vincent and his brother Theo, which is truly, truly beautiful. Throughout the episode, Mimi discusses 3 iconic works, and we also take a tour into the topic of why actually being such a famous artist is actually sometimes not that great at all, because people, aka myself, tend to think there's nothing new to learn about him and there couldn't possibly be any new information that could have been left out. How wrong I was. Now, before you listen, this is just to apologise to say that audio quality isn't up to its normal standards, and I really apologise about that, and I particularly apologise to Mimi. It doesn't take away from the quality of the conversation, but just the voices aren't as sharp as what I would normally like. Out with that, it is a fantastic episode, and I'm really excited for you to listen. So sit back and relax as Mimi and I discuss the one and only Vincent Van Gogh. Vincent Van Gogh. What made you decide to speak about Vincent, or what attracts you to Vincent's work?
So I've always had just an awe with himself and his work. And I was saying to you earlier, I think nowadays he's considered as kind of like one of the world's greatest artists and almost like a figure in pop culture, that kind of thing. But I think where a lot of people kind of not necessarily see him wrongly, but where I kind of have like it's like a personal issue that I just like to speak about. But it's essentially that obviously he was very mentally ill and he had a hard life, but I feel it's kind of lost in translation where in a lot of publications and a lot of just kind of things that are out there about him, he's seen as a mad artist. So he's seen as an artist that creates because he was mentally ill, but it's not because of that, it's despite it. And I think there's so much more history and intricacies and just brilliance in his life that are completely worth mentioning and completely worth learning about and educating yourself about, because he shouldn't be almost belittled to just being a mentally ill artist, because that's not all that he was.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think there's a lot of things about Vincent Van Gogh that people have completely glossed over, like, or a lot of things that have completely got lost in translation. Like when he cut off his ear, I always thought it was because he was madly in love with a woman, because that's what I was told when I was younger, and I've never really double check that fact. Or for some reason I thought he lived a really long time and that he created his whole life. That's something as well. I just always assumed he was creating his whole life, and he really wasn't. He had a really, really short pocket where he was actually an artist. And when I was reading about him before I jumped on the call with you this morning, I was kind of like, oh, he's actually kind of the poster boy for just because you haven't, like, still trying to figure out what you want to do in your 30s. And I don't know why. I've always just assumed that because he was a creative genius and that he was I mean, I always saw him as like a struggling artist. But yeah, there is this thing where people think, oh, he was mad, and something like one of the paintings that we're going to talk about, the Starry Night, was produced in a manic episode as a way of trying to sort of work out the demons. And it's not that at all. Like he worked to calm himself down. It was the only thing that really sort of distracted him from what was going on in his head, and it helped him to concentrate, which I think's art is amazing at doing that, really. Like you think about it, but I mean, you're an artist. When you create and you're just in the moment, it must just be such a fantastic distraction from everything else, because you absolutely have to concentrate.
Well, I mean, personally, like, I see myself as an autobiographical artist, so a lot of my work is cathartic, and I think in specifically Vincent's later years, that premise is shared because, like you said, the Starry Night, it was created in the asylum, and he's quoted as saying things very similar along the lines of painting is the best medicine for him. It's when he feels, well, it's when he felt calm. But like you touched on there, I think the main issue is that a lot of his life, a lot of his torment and sadness and just negative things are completely romanticized, and they're not actually a reflection of his talent. Like, don't get me wrong, they completely feed into it, like they do in mine, like they do into other autobiographical or just emotional artist work. Of course, it's a driving force, but it's not the only reflection of who he is, because he was obviously a complicated and highly emotional person, and his work is absolutely beautiful. But for example, if you look at his very early work compared to his very late work, they are completely juxtaposed. Like, it was only later in life that he picked up the surge in colour palette and the mark making, whereas before he was very much it was like a dull toned kind of like life still kind of thing. Like, it was like, for example, his painting the potato eaters was just a study of people, whereas obviously in his later years you see a lot of Japanese influence through like the tight cropping of images, the color palettes, even just like the subject matters. A lot of it became nature because that's what he loved, that's where he felt kind of safe.
And I mean, can you give us like a little bit of a whistle stop tour of how he got from this sort of, struggling, well, he was not a struggling artist, but how did he come to making art? Because he had a very interesting sort of zigzag way of getting there.
Yeah, so the thing is he, I don't know how to put it nicely, but his life before painting was essentially just a culmination of failures. Like, he tried to be a preacher, he tried to be a teacher, he had absolutely disastrous love affairs, which he's kind of infamous for having these unrequited, almost like crushes that just never went anywhere. And then I think he was around 30 because he was only painting for around 7 years. Like, that was his working career. How he kind of got into it was he was always interested in art. His mother was an amateur painter. His brother Theo was an art dealer. And he kind of got in contact with his brother Theo. And Theo always believed in him and kind of put Vincent's talent out there, because he even financially supported him throughout his entire career, because he wanted his brother to do well and he wanted the world to see his works. And that's kind of how he got into it in the first instance.
Because he was living in the Netherlands, and Theo was actually his brother, as you said, was an art dealer, invited him to come and stay with him in Paris. And it was kind of Theo inviting him to Paris that he was introduced to an amazing group of painters that we all know as the Impressionists, but also the developments that were happening within the art world, particularly with paints and things like that, which I find very, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'll be able to go into more detail about it as we progress through the artwork, but there was, when Vincent moved to Paris is when things kind of started picking up pace, and it got, in terms of storytelling, a lot more interesting for his life. It was a lot more fast paced, that kind of thing. And some of the things that happened then kind of reflected what was to be for the rest of his life.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I've really enjoyed about, so we're going to talk about three very sort of key paintings, and what I've really enjoyed is learning that there's a really interesting and beautiful link, and as you put it before we started recording, it all kind of comes full circle. So the first painting that you've chosen to talk about is, I would say, one of, if not the best painting by Van Gogh, which is Starry Night. And I've mentioned this once or twice on different podcasts where people have mentioned, oh, it was in this, or this inspired this. But he painted this at a really crucial time in his life. So can you tell us a bit about, can you set the scene behind the events sort of leading up to Starry Night?
Yeah, of course. So Starry Night was painted in, I think it was 1889. Yeah, it was the 18th of June, 1889. And what essentially it is a study from the view from his asylum window, because he was admitted to St. Remy Asylum, but he actually put himself forward to be submitted, which is just brilliant in itself, that, you know, he had the self-awareness to say, no, look, I need kind of help. But what kind of sets Starry Night apart from his other paintings is that this is kind of when he started to use his imagination in his paintings instead of just doing life copies. He painted it directly from memory, because obviously he couldn't paint in the dark at night when he saw it. And I just think this is like the most interesting fact ever, but he genuinely thought that this painting was a failure. And for quite a lot of his paintings that he thought were quote unquote failures, he would just paint over them. So unfortunately, he did die. He shot himself, but if that hadn't have happened so soon after Starry Night was created, we could have never have even seen it. Yeah. The thing about Saint Remy as well is that it was kind of the perfect fit for Vincent in his kind of mind state at that time, because there was only 41 other patients in this asylum, which is kind of unheard of.
That's really small.
Yeah, it was insanely small, but the staff there always treated him with like the utmost respect and kindness. And Theo, his brother, actually paid for 2 rooms side by side so that he could have a studio to continue to paint. And being in Saint Remy gave him the absolute freedom to just create all the time.
Yeah, it's amazing, because he was, like you said, he sort of self-checked himself into St. Remy, and he had a studio there where he was encouraged to create, which I think's amazing and very forward thinking. But the gentleman that, when I was doing a little bit of research about the asylum that he was in, the owner really sort of believed and sort of banged the drum for the therapies that sort of creating and music could have with you, but also being in nature. So he had made a point, because it used to be, I think it used to be an old monastery, and then it was bought over and converted into an asylum. And then he painted all these, or he didn't paint, sorry, the owner of the asylum planted rather all these beautiful gardens for his patients to go out and sort of wander in, and really sort of championed being in nature as a way of healing, which is very, very forward thinking of them, where most other places it would have been just sit in your cell until you've worked it out, sort of thing. And I think it's amazing that he used to be allowed out to paint, and that's something that he loved to do as well, of course, because he famously loved working in the landscape. And it was thanks to the developments of easels and sort of color tubes. You know, it was round about this time that portable paint tubes were invented, so he could like strap all these things to his back and go off and paint. But he was incredibly prolific when he was here. Yes.
Yeah, well, I think what's so interesting about, like as you said, about the owner saying that nature is healing, is it's so reflective in Van Gogh's entire there. Like a lot of his works are of landscapes and nature, as you said. And another really interesting fact to me is that he was actually supposed to go to a bigger institution in Marseille with so many more pages. It was over 1,000. So it's like, it's just funny how the butterfly effect of things work, because if he hadn't have gone there, then there's no way we would have seen all the works that we've seen from him now, because he spent so much of his time in the asylum painting that he finished around 150 paintings in just his time there, because it took him, his working time was generally about a couple of hours. And he's quoted as saying, work distracts me infinitely better than anything else, and if I could once really throw myself into it with all of my energy, that might possibly be the best remedy, which is what we touched upon earlier. But I think being not only in nature, given the freedom to do what he wanted and to be just painting all the time, had much more of an effect than the kind of stereotypical or general medications and talking therapies would have done.
Because it's, going back to what we said about the institution that he was in, so he should have gone to this humongous place in Marseille and instead went to Saint Remy. And like we've touched on, he had his studio. They were very forward thinking in terms of his therapies and his treatments. And realistically, if that was today, all these kind of things would have been prescribed anyway. And they seem to think he was bipolar. Is that correct? This is what he was suffering with.
Yeah, so there's a lot of like stipulation around what it is specifically that he suffered with. So I've heard that he had depression, that it's alleged schizophrenia, bipolar, that kind of thing. But from my research and cross-referencing and that kind of thing, I see the most fitting kind of quote-unquote diagnosis for Van Gogh is bipolar. But he suffered with manic episodes and auditory hallucinations, which I think the difficult thing is, especially with diagnosing, is that unless you're a medical health professional and you're with the person at the time, it's quite hard, because we've got like recounts from different people who knew him differently and that kind of thing. So it's hard to put together a full picture of what could be causing his mental health. So it's hard to make an accurate or acute decision on what it could have been that he was specifically suffering with, but it's kind of in the realms of bipolar, depression, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but what you're wanting to hit home, though, and that you've touched on previously, is his mental health was not the reason that he created. This was something that he'd kind of scratched an itch, if you will, and just was constantly had to create. It was his source of enjoyment and peace. And you said a few minutes ago that he was incredibly prolific and he used to spend maybe a few hours on a painting. And in terms of, did he used to just work and would he do studies, or was it something that he would just paint and it was done on the canvas? Or how, do you have anything about how he worked? And
yeah, so just to touch on what you said, firstly, is that, yeah, like I said, I completely agree. I feel that many people misread his paintings as a descent into madness, when in fact it was like a form of therapy to him. So it's a completely juxtaposing point, because it was saving him, not making him work. Like, do you see what I mean? It's like a cathartic release. It wasn't that his paintings were essentially a documentation of him having a manic episode. It was a form of him coping. And for the latter point, yeah, so as far as I've researched and I can see into, is that essentially a lot of his work were essentially studies of things around him. But in the asylum, for a period of time, he had a very limited view of what was around him, if that makes sense. So the main landscape was the one outside of his window. So of course he did multiple studies of it, which we have Starry Night from. And I mean, once he was allowed to start going out and painting different landscapes, of course, but it wasn't until this time that we started to see more so his imagination coming into fruition in his paintings, as opposed to it being right, this is the life study.
I mean, I think I'm just, while you're talking, I'm just looking at Starry Night now, and there's such an energy in it that I think is so powerful. And I don't know, there just seems to be this need to sort of get it out onto the canvas for me. Like, I love this cypress tree that sort of cuts up the canvas to the left hand side. I mean, it's just, it's the colors in it as well that I love. I just think it was so out there for its time, and so brave almost, if that makes sense. That's such a silly thing to say, but I just think it's such a brave thing to paint, and it's like an experiment almost, because he loved, this is something he loved when he met the Impressionists, color and experimenting with color as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I don't think it's a silly sentiment at all, because in the last 5 years of his painting career, I touched on it earlier, but we see a complete juxtaposition in his colour palette. Mm-hmm. So it's going from these muted dark colours to all of a sudden these bright colour palettes that he was so insanely clued up on colour theory and how to make colours kind of not clash, but pop off against one another. And I think we spoke about it earlier. You said that paint tubes were starting to come around then, because I think, again, what is just utterly iconic about Van Gogh's work is his mark making techniques, which seem very kind of free in fruition, like quick in fruition, but also seems very kind of like every mark is meant to be exactly where it is. But obviously he paints thickly, like with his paint, but a lot of the time it came directly from the tube of paint, which is just really interesting to know on, because obviously, as you mentioned earlier, this is around the time where paint tubes were actually invented.
Yeah, and I've read, because I know he and his brother Theo had a really loving relationship, yes, but he relied very heavily on Theo. And in preparation for this, I was reading some of his, because they wrote extensively to each other, and I read a few of their letters very quickly when he was in the asylum, because there's an amazing website, and I think you touched on this in your notes that you sent me as well. There's an amazing website where they've translated a large portion of their letters that they wrote to each other. So I had a look at the ones where they're when he's in San Remi, and he's just continuously requesting, can you send me brushes, can you send me paint, can you send me canvases? And I just think this was, I don't know, it was a time of like unbelievable creativity, which I just love. And for me, but knowing that now, looking at Starry Night, I'm like, yeah, I see that, because there's a we want to get this out beautiful, okay, there's more things to do, there's more paintings to make. But what I didn't know about behind the story behind Starry Night is one of the reasons that he was experimenting with color, and kind of the only, we touched on that previously. I had thought he'd cut off his, the very famous cutting off his ear incident, and I had thought, and I was told when I was younger, that it was because he was in love with a woman, but it was a fight with Gauguin, and the only really account that we have of this happening is from Gauguin. And I mean, yeah, I think it's because he really respected Gauguin as an artist, and they were quite good friends.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of like Chinese whispers, because when I was younger, I just genuinely full-heartedly believed that he cut his entire ear off, and like, but the thing is, he didn't. He cut part of it off, and like you said, it's kind of like Chinese whispers. Oh, did you know it's because he was in love with this woman? Mm-hmm. And I'll touch more upon the story of the ear cutting incident later, but his inspiration to paint from the imagination was full-heartedly Gauguin. and like I've touched on before, he didn't do it until he was in the asylum. But I think it's such a beautiful depiction of his mind state altering to show us in a tangible sense a feeling, rather than having a nature study. We can have like this tangible sense of seeing what he is feeling, but not directly linked to something physical, if that makes sense. So of course we see they say it's called a cypress tree.
Yes,
Yeah, the tree, which obviously is a tangible real thing, but it's so exaggerated that it goes like from the bottom of the painting right through to the top, and it's almost like it's linking heaven and earth together.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think it's also important to note that the town that he's painting, I mean, depending on what you're reading and or watching, the town wasn't there in that exact spot. This landscape is completely imagined in some way, and that, like we said previously, you know, he was from the Netherlands, so he was a Dutchman, and the great Dutch artist, he was a massive fan of Rembrandt, and of course lots of famous Dutch landscape painters, and their paintings dedicated a lot of their canvas to the sky. So there's this theory that it was potentially like a nod to the romanticists of, you know, his Dutch romanticists of the past, with sort of giving the sky so much power.
Well, do you know what as well, funnily enough, what I've heard is he was so influenced by the Japanese culture in art that there's so many theories about how you see the first kind of like swirls in the sky just behind the cypress tree at the top.
Yeah,
that they're an ode to Hokusai's The Great Wave.
oh, you can see it though, like if when you say it like that, yeah, you can,
because it's the same composition of the wave, because he was so greatly inspired by Hokusai and the artists of his kind of generation, that it's really interesting, because had someone not pointed that out to me, I don't think I would have ever made the connection, not knowing that Vincent was so highly just in awe of their work.
Yeah, I mean, because for this, I didn't realize when I was doing the research, I didn't realize he was so heavily influenced by Japanese sort of posters and prints and things like that, and he collected that quite extensively, and he tried to set up a commune or something, not a commune, but like he tried to set up like an artists group, much like what the Japanese painters were doing, and it kind of fell flat in its face because everyone was like, no thanks, Vincent, you're a bit difficult. But this is where sort of him and Gauguin start to become very, very friendly. But I just love this painting, and I think it's one of these things that people don't give it enough time. I think it's very good that people are like, oh yeah, that's that one, move on very quickly, but you have to sort of sit in front of it. And just everything about it I love the colors, I love the energy, I love the movement, and I've never seen it. Have you ever seen it in person?
So I haven't seen the actual painting in person, but I've been to, you know, the interactive exhibitions of Van Gogh's work where it all moves.
Oh, how was that?
Right. So I've been to one in York, and I've been to one in London. I would definitely say the one in London is a million times better, but they are so beautiful, because it's kind of it's not like a history lesson, if you know what I mean, but it's as somebody who loves his work, it's so beautiful to see it given the time and the love that it deserves, and seeing it kind of cascading on yourself as well. It makes you feel a part of something kind of bigger.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful to kind of see it moving, because I know that there's been a few films about Van Gogh, especially Loving Vincent, which was all painted in his style about his life. So it's really nice to see that kind of thing. But like you said about Gauguin earlier, he first met Gauguin and other kind of artists in that culmination in Paris. because he moved to be there with his brother Theo. So that's where he met all the kind of like post-impressionist artists. And like you said about the kind of colony of artists that you wanted to create, that was directly influenced by Japanese artists, because there was these colonies of Japanese artists that went up into the mountains and all painted together and all that kind of thing. So he wanted to do what they were doing because he was so in awe and inspired by them. But nobody would go with him because he was a really complicated man. He had a short fuse. And just nobody wanted to go with him. I've seen noted multiple times that Theo felt like he had to apologise on behalf of Vincent multiple times. And I mean, I won't go too deeply into like all of his relationships because I'm aware that we have like a time limit, but this kind of leads me on really nicely to the second painting, which is the sunflower paintings, because there's actually 7 of them.
Which I have no idea about. I just thought there was one sunflower painting and that everyone lost their marbles over it.
Yeah, because the interesting thing is that you do generally just think, oh, there's just one, but he created so many copies of it and different ones because Theo had convinced Gauguin to go and live with Vincent and create with him. And Vincent was so excited and wanted it to be such a nice space for him that he wanted to decorate the whole house in sunflowers. And he wanted it to be perfect for Gauguin's kind of appearance. And obviously this was all before it went wrong. But what I love so much about the specific sunflower picture that we're speaking about is that he kind of abandoned his colour theory knowledge in kind of the post-impressionist way. And there you can see paintings before where he's used a blue background to kind of push forward the flowers. But in this one, it's a very yellow palette because yellow we connotate with being happy. But somehow in this painting, it really, really works, even though it's all different tones of yellow. It's still so beautiful and you can still pay attention to every single detail in the painting without the background taking anything away, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because it really is. And very typical, I've seen this in the, oh yeah, know that sunflowers, that's Vincent, yeah, got it. But you're right, near enough, I would say 90% of this painting is yellow, is different shades of yellow. And again, just showing him as a sort of master of colour theory. He just knew exactly what to pick to help it stand out. But it's such an iconic work. But what I hadn't realised is that most of the sunflowers are actually dead in this one that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, that kind of leads on from it, the bulk of the painting being in yellow, because it's been noted, I don't know how accurate of a source it can be, but that yellow was Vincent's favourite colour because it represents life, energy and happiness. So we see a lot of the flowers being dead and kind of, well, the seed heads being bare, and like interestingly enough, you can see in like the right hand corner, one of the seed heads only has one petal left, so you can see it kind of in the process of the flowers kind of dying, and they look kind of almost like spiky. But when you read into the kind of meaning behind it, is that the seed heads actually show a cycle of life. So it's not that these flowers are all dead and it's a moody painting. I think that's a really nice juxtaposition with it being yellow, with the subject matter being, oh, they're just flowers, when actually you can see all the seed heads are still there and then they're going to bloom again. So it's a cycle of life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way to look at it. And it's just I don't know, I just think this is such an iconic Vincent painting. and it has such an important link to Starry Night, what we've previously spoken about, because this was kind of the final, when he was painting this series and when he was living in the south of France with Gauguin, this was kind of really the final straw that sort of led him to check himself in to Saint-Remy. I would love you to talk a little bit about the sort of tempestuous relationship between Gauguin and Vincent, because I was reading that Gauguin kind of felt, because Theo, Vincent's brother, was an art dealer and had sold so many of his paintings, he kind of felt like a debt of gratitude to be like, oh fine, I'll go live with your crazy brother. And Vincent was just so in awe of him as an artist, and like you said, wanted to make the studio, or where they were living together, to be this beautiful place full of creativity, sunflowers, and sort of the beginning of this, like potentially his dream of having this artist's studio in the south of France, or this colony where everyone goes to create. And they really didn't get on. They really sort of butted heads quite a bit because of how they created things.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's absolutely it, as you put it, is Gauguin felt a complete debt of gratitude to Theo. And Vincent was in absolute awe of Gauguin and was so inspired by his works. And it was almost like, you know, when you put somebody so high on a pedestal, it's like they can't do wrong. They're amazing. Well, he was a person as well. And I think the trouble that they kind of run into is that Van Gogh was a very short-tempered man. Obviously, if he had bipolar, which we touched upon earlier, his suffering mental health definitely won't have helped their kind of budding relationship, because at the end of the day, it's two men who are both creative that don't necessarily know each other all too well, being in each other's creative space constantly, which isn't ever going to kind of go well, especially because from Gauguin's point of view, he was doing it as a favor. From Vincent's point of view, he was doing it because this was everything he wanted. So it's that power struggle of, it is almost a lie to Vincent on Gauguin's behalf. But as you touched on earlier, the only account we really have for when Van Gogh famously did cut his ear off is Gauguin's perspective, because what is kind of recounted is that Van Gogh started acting very strangely, and then he started threatening Gauguin with a razor, and then Gauguin ran off, because apparently Van Gogh kind of snapped out of it and was like, what am I doing? After the whole culmination of all of this, he then cuts part of his ear off, packages it up, and gives it to a woman in a brothel. Now, I'm not entirely sure why he did this. I don't know if anybody is really entirely sure why this happened, apart from it being a manic episode. But I also think what many people don't kind of know about this is Vincent had many like near strokes with death. He nearly died from this experience, from the loss of blood. He, before being in Saint Remy, had eaten paint, drank turpentine, and then obviously, tragically, at the age, I think it was 37, he fatally shot himself in the chest and then died 2 days after. So he had many strokes of nearly dying, a lot of which being by his own hand.
Yeah, and I think I had absolutely no idea that he was that injured after he cut his ear off. And I don't know why I didn't really sort of give it the time of day. I think just because I know he went to an asylum, and then you're right, he was really, really ill from that. And I had absolutely no idea that he drank paints and turpentine, sort of literally being killed by colour. And I had, this is going to sound terrible, I had forgotten that he killed himself. I knew that he died really young. But is the gun that he used not on display in a museum somewhere like grim, like, oh, this is the gun that he used? And I don't know if it is or not, but I was watching a video, and a gun appeared, So I was like, oh God, somebody somewhere is like ultimate collector's item, just really sad. But when he died though, his brother was so grief stricken that he, again going back to the painting, because sunflowers were such a huge part of his life, he covered the coffin in sunflowers.
Yeah, what's really interesting to know as well is that his coffin actually had sunflowers painted all over it. And when he laid dead, his brother, and I think I might be wrong on this, but I think his brother's wife decorated the room where he lay with all of his latest paintings, so he was surrounded by his art even after life. And I think that's why it's such a nice representation of, as I said earlier, the paintings being a cycle of life. It's almost like even in death, it's like memento mori, memento verde, like remember that you have to die, but also remember that you have to live. And it's, if you believe in reincarnation and that kind of thing, it's such a beautiful send off. And something that's worth noting as well is that when he did commit suicide, it's because he felt like such a burden to his brother, who was paying financially for the majority of his adult life for him to be an artist and carry on with his career. It was after he'd been released from St. Remy, and he took himself off into the field. He actually set up his paints and his easel, and then he turned away from it and shot himself in the chest, and he just missed his heart. So he woke up obviously thinking that he would have died, and then I think he lived below a doctor. So I think the doctor kind of got him back together, and him and his brother kind of reminisced on their childhood. And Vincent had said, I really want to go home, please take me home. And his brother had promised that he would once he recovered, but obviously he never did, which is absolutely heartbreaking. But like you said, I think it's so weird that the gun is like on display as like a collector's item, because I understand the interest in it, but it's kind of like, it's very morbid.
It's very, very grim. I'll maybe fact check that and put something at the end of the episode if I can find something on it. But there's a brilliant chat actually that I watched in prep for this conversation, and it was filmed in 2016, and it's from a curator at the National Gallery, where this painting is at the National Gallery in London. Although I think it's on loan, because I was at the National Gallery quite recently and it wasn't there. So I think it might be at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which again I've never been to because the queue is always way too long.
Yeah.
To get into. It's the only museum in the world where people are queuing before COVID, I mean, that people are queuing around the door to get in. But in this conversation, I think the curator is called Cullen, and I'll leave a link to it in the show notes below as well. And he reads a letter from an art critic who was a very big fan of Vincent, and speaks of the love of Vincent and his brother, and sort of describes sort of how the room had been set up, and sort of a lasting tribute to his brother. So I'll leave a link to that because it's really beautiful, and again sort of dispels a myth that I believed until I started researching for this, that Vincent wasn't very celebrated during his lifetime. I know he only sold one painting, but he was kind of just on the cusp of becoming everything that he wanted to be. Almost like he was being shown in exhibitions. His peers really respected him and saw him as a great talent, and he tragically took his own life before he could really see his success come to fruition, which is quite sad. And there's again such a story tied up within a pot of sunflowers that you don't really see unless you give it time and do a deep dive.
No, I completely agree with you, and I completely agree with that sentiment, that I feel that a lot of Van Gogh's paintings, because they're so iconic and infamous, that people respect them and they think he's very talented. Like, just reflected in Vincent's life, there was nobody in his peer group or his brother that didn't think that he was talented. His brother was his biggest supporter, which is why he financially supported him for his entire working career. But I think the issue that we run into is that because his paintings are so iconic, I don't think a lot of people give them the time to kind of learn more behind them or see more deeply into them. It's more so kind of like, oh, that's a Van Gogh. Like, because if I said to you, he was Dutch and he cut his ear off and he did a painting of sunflowers, straight away, oh, Van Gogh. 100%. Because a lot of his paintings are just connotated with him as a person, as opposed to the works themselves being appreciated.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because he is so iconic, and you could show anybody that those sunflowers or anybody that painting of Starry Night and they'll know it's him. And I feel there's a few other artists like that, but in particular I always go back to Frida Kahlo. And when I say to people, big eyebrows, Mexican, and they'll go, oh yeah, that Frida Kahlo, yeah. And I think she's somebody as well that people she's just so iconic that people almost kind of skip over her, like, and same with Vincent, like they kind of skip over her works to kind of really just don't give them the time that they really deserve, because there's been so much written on it and so much discussed on it. I don't know, but again, this is 2021, that there's still conversations to be had, there's still things to say, and I've loved learning about these three paintings and the link between them. So and obviously once Vincent had been admitted, and that was kind of the end to the friendship with him and Gauguin, which was another reason which completely devastated him as well.
Yeah, so after the ordeal with him being like jeering at Gauguin with the razor, that was a complete period to the relationship. It was completely done. They never spoke again. And following this is, like you said, when he self-admitted to be in the asylum, where he painted Starry Night. But again, it leads me on very nicely to his self-portrait with the bandaged ear. And the thing that I love about this portrait, because Van Gogh did multiple portraits of himself, because he didn't have any money. It was hard to find models. The only other people that modelled for him was, I know that his postman modelled for him a few times, and then a prostitute that he was in love with modelled for him a few times, but he was ultimately given an ultimatum from his brother to either be cut off from him and his family or split. So he did. But the reason I love this painting so much is because it is, personally, I see it as a step apart from his other portraits, because it almost immortalizes his kind of torment, and just it must have been so cathartic to just get out this emotion forever, because obviously he lived in a small town, so you know what gossip's like anyway. But I like the fact that he's reclaiming the fact that, yeah, I did do this, but it's still me. I really like the fact that, first of all, he takes that power back, or at least that's what I read into it. And also I love the fact that it kind of juxtaposes the excruciating pain he must have been going through with a really serene and controlled colour palette and brush strokes.
Yeah.
So it's not, obviously we see his like iconic mark making in this painting, but it's not frantic. The colours are beautiful, but they're not in your face. Like it seems very calm and almost like he's at peace with himself.
Yeah. I'd never really looked at it like that before, actually, and you're so right, because even like the brush strokes, they all seem to be bar the sort of, he's wearing this beautiful sort of fluffy hat, so bar the fluffy hat, all the brush strokes seem to be going in the same direction. And he has this sort of, he's in the background, he's got this very sort of highlighter lime green sort of color in the back, that isn't sort of bowl you over like, whoa, that's a bit much. It's really serene, and I've never looked at it like him reclaiming his narrative and being like, yep, I did it, this is what I look like now. I love that. I love that idea. I think that's beautiful.
Because I think the thing is, as well, as why I read into it in that kind of sense, is that he didn't have to have the he didn't have to be in the position where that ear's on show. He could have painted it from the other side. So it's almost like he wanted it to be there. And as well, the title, it shows that that's the main focus point. And just something else that I'd like to touch upon is obviously he was so in awe of Japanese artists. You can see in the back there's like a Japanese style painting that would have been on his wall. So I just think this painting is so unapologetically himself, and we see so many different parts of his personality through his love of colour, his mark making, and then even behind the painting, just things that are in it, there's his easel with a canvas on it, and then there's the Japanese print. I absolutely love this painting.
I think it's an amazing painting, and I've done the classic thing of, oh yeah, I know it, and then I started reading about it, and then in your notes that you sent me, you said you've mentioned the Japanese print, and I was like, what? And I went back and I was like, oh my gosh, how have I missed that? So I'm guilty myself of not giving things the time that it deserves, but it's true though. Like, it's kind of like, and for me as well, the door, there's a door just over his shoulder to the side of the Japanese print. For me, now having had this discussion with you, I'm kind of looking at the door and thinking, oh, is it half open? Is that telling us that he likes to go outside to paint? Is that a nod to nature? Because he has his three great, it would make complete sense, painting, Japanese art, and the great outdoors that he loved to create in. Phenomenal self-portrait. And if I compare it to my favorite self-portrait of Van Gogh, is in Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and it's near enough completely blue, and the background is a bit like Starry Night. It's very sort of frantic and sort of that sort of fizziness that happens where he's trying to like get to the top of the canvas as much as possible. And if I think in my head and compare it to this is so controlled and relaxed, and it's beautiful. It's just beautiful.
Well, I think what's nice about what you said about kind of not looking further, like being guilty of that, I think we're all guilty of that, because especially like you said, with people like Frida Kahlo, with Van Gogh, because they are so celebrated in today's culture, and there's so many events, there's so many films, this kind of thing, that you kind of think, no, I think I know everything, because why would they leave that out, kind of thing. But it's not that they aren't celebrated people or artists, it's just that I think it's an empathic thing, is that I'm like, but there's more to this than that, because it's almost kind of very commercial now. So while it's nice that they are given the time that they should be given, it's that there's still little things to read into afterwards, which I just think it's, especially with this painting specifically, there's so much to unpack that I don't think is spoken about enough in just everyday life, like in these museums and in these exhibits and stuff. Like you said, that talk in 2016 is an absolutely brilliant talk, and I recommend anybody going to listen to it. But specifically with this painting, is turning a horrific experience into an iconic painting with so much to unpack that will be studied for centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to once again hit home, his artistic career was so short, 7 years. 7 years, that's it. And when you think of Van Gogh and what he's achieved, and the enormity that surrounds his name when you see it, you packed a lot into 7 years. It's amazing, the level of creativity even things that happened in his personal life, and still managed to create through it, I think is phenomenal.
Well, I think the main thing for me is that I think I touched on it earlier, but the fact that he failed at pretty much everything for 30 years, like be it relationships, be it careers, everything, he's such an iconic figure to prove that it's never too late to start doing what you love or to find what you love. Because, as we said, he wasn't some child prodigy. He taught himself to paint. I don't think he picked up a paintbrush or a pencil until the ages between, it was either 27 or 30. I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but his working career was only 7 years, and the amount of just incredible, iconic, absolutely beautiful art that now people are not only still speaking about it now, but it's still moving people now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mimi, thank you so much. I've absolutely loved talking to you about these 3 paintings. It's really made me reevaluate and reappreciate Vincent, and I hope that everyone that's listening, please go and look at the show notes. Please go and check out my Instagram, where these will be in the highlights reel if you want to get a good idea. And if you're based in the UK, 2 of the 3 paintings that we spoke about are in the UK. So the self-portrait with bandaged ear, that is in the Courthold collection, and the Courthold has just reopened. We're recording this in November 2021, so it literally opened about 2 weeks ago to the public again. And the Sunflowers is in the National Gallery, although I do think it's on loan. And the Starry Night, for all our American listeners, is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Mimi, before you go and you tell us where people can connect with you, I do have one question which I ask, or try and remember to ask, all my guests when they're here, and it's quite a big one. So, and you can make it as big or as small and as personal to you. But my final question to you is, why is art important?
So specifically for me, art is so integral to who I am and what I do, because I've always been so interested in it. I'm a full-time artist now, and I genuinely think without art, I wouldn't be nearly as mentally well as I am now, because it's such a cathartic release for me. And personally, it's a way of expressing things that I would never want to say or feel too uncomfortable to speak about with people close to my life, people not close to my life. I've always found it very hard to say, look, I'm really struggling. But if I put it all down on a painting and put it out, people are still seeing it and they resonate with it. And that's what's important to me, is that not only am I kind of looking after my own mental health, but maybe other people that feel the same but can't find the words either can say, this is how I feel too.
Yeah, I love that. I think art is just such a powerful communication tool. And I think that's exactly what particularly Vincent in his self-portrait with bandaged ear is trying to say. He's communicating without using words, and it's just so powerful. So thank you so much. Beautifully done. Mimi, where can people find you and connect with you and all things like that?
So I have a art studio and a shop in York City Centre. It's down Flying Gate. It's called NI Studios. It's 2024 Flying Gate if you're around in York or nearby. I've got a website which is nistudios.co.uk. All of my links are on there, or on Instagram, which I'm most active on, is at n.i.studios.
Amazing, that's great. And I'll leave a link to all of your channels where people can connect with you in the show notes, and I'll also leave a link when I publish this episode on Instagram as well. Thank you so much. I am forever indebted to you for reigniting an appreciation and a love for Vincent. So thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for having me and letting me ramble.
And there you have it, another episode of Jo's Art History podcast. Once again, I'd just like to thank Mimi for coming on and speaking so brilliantly about Vincent van Gogh, and apologies again that the audio quality for this episode isn't up to my normal standard. I don't really know what's happened, but I'm an art historian, I'm not a tech wizard unfortunately. I did try my best to improve it as much as possible, but I hope you still enjoyed it. If you would like to get in touch, you're very welcome to. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can message me via Instagram, which is @joesarthistory. My DMs are always open. As always, all images which we discussed throughout this podcast episode are available to view on my Instagram highlights reel. So this episode is 45. If you go along to the number 45 at the top of my highlights reel on my Instagram page, you'll be able to view the images there. We also have some follow-on material and further learning in the show notes below, so please make sure that you check that out if you would like to watch or read any of the materials which Mimi and I discussed throughout the podcast. As always, if you were able to, it would be great if you could leave the podcast a review. You can do this on iTunes, and you can also now do this on Spotify. This podcast is also available to watch on YouTube. My name is Jo McLaughlin, your resident host and friendly art historian here on the Jo's Art History podcast, and I look forward to welcoming you next time. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art is for all. Bye.